Welcome in, everybody. I'm so excited for this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big one. This is all about autism diagnosis, and we're really going to get into it. I know this is something that a lot of you have been wanting us to cover,
Mm.
and we have this incredible guide here, Navigating the Autism Diagnosis Process, a complete guide. And we're going to go through it step by step and really break it down into manageable pieces. So by the end of this, you're going to be walking away feeling like you really understand this process and all its little nuances.
Yeah, I think a lot of people get really overwhelmed by this topic, and it's totally understandable because it's complex, but this guy does a really good job of sort of laying it all out in a way that's really accessible. And one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that it really emphasizes that autism presents differently in everyone. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, it's so true. And that's actually one of the things that I found so interesting when I was first reading through this guide. Some of the signs that it highlights, you wouldn't necessarily think of them immediately when you think of autism. Like for children, for example, the guide talks about the fact that, yes, there can be difficulty with social interaction, but then on the flip side, there's also this incredible, intense focus that they can have on specific interests. It's almost paradoxical.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of these signs like that come from, the core aspects of autism, like differences in sensory processing and social communication. So, that intense focus that you're talking about, it could be a heightened sensitivity to certain stimuli or, a fascination with patterns and details that most people wouldn't even notice.
That makes a lot of sense. And then for adults, too, there were some things that was like, I wouldn't have necessarily connected that to autism. Like the guide mentions things like difficulty understanding sarcasm or nonverbal cues.
Oh, yeah. And even a strong preference for routines and predictability. It goes beyond just, being organized. It's about needing that structure to manage sensory input and reduce anxiety in a world that can feel very overwhelming for someone with autism.
Right. Okay. So let's say you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, some of this is ringing a bell either for myself or for someone I know. What's the next step? What should people do if they're picking up on these signs?
Well, it's so important to remember that self-diagnosis isn't the answer. Seeking a professional evaluation is really the most important step you can take, because that's the only way to get an accurate diagnosis and make sure you're getting the right support tailored to your specific needs.
Okay, so let's walk through that then.
Well,
How do you actually get that evaluation? If we start with children, the guide makes it very clear that pediatricians have a really important role here.
yeah, definitely. Starting with a conversation with your child's pediatrician is essential because they can do a developmental screening. And if needed, they can refer you to a specialist who can conduct like a more comprehensive assessment. Early intervention is key. And thankfully, a lot of countries have programs specifically designed to assess and support young children who might be on the spectrum.
What about adults? What if you're an adult and you're thinking, maybe I need an evaluation? What are the steps for that?
The guide mentions some helpful online self-assessment tools like the AQ test, the Autism Spectrum Quotient test, but it really emphasizes that these are just a starting point. It's not a replacement for a professional evaluation. So if you're concerned, talk to your doctor. They can refer you to specialists like neuropsychologists or psychiatrists who have expertise in autism.
Gotcha. So let's say you've talked to your doctor and you're ready for that evaluation. What can you expect? What actually happens during the diagnostic process itself? The guide goes into some pretty specific assessments that are used.
Yeah, they do. The specialists will gather a detailed developmental history, but they also use standardized assessments and observations to get a comprehensive picture.
One of the assessments that really caught my eye was the 802. That stands for the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. And it sounds pretty involved.
It is. It's a series of structured tasks and activities designed to assess social and communication skills. So, for example, one task might involve having the individual describe a picture or tell a story. And the specialist isn't just listening to what they're saying, but also how they're saying it, like their tone of voice, their body language, their eye contact, all these subtle cues that can reveal a lot about how someone processes social information.
That makes a lot of sense. And then the guide also mentioned the ADIR, the Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised. And this one sounds intense, too.
It's definitely in-depth. It's a structured interview, usually with caregivers or family members, to really get a thorough understanding of the individual's developmental history. They ask very detailed questions about things like early language development, social interactions, any unusual behaviors or interests.
So it's really about gathering information from multiple sources.
Yes.
Not just relying on one test or observation.
Absolutely. And those additional observations from parents, teachers, even partners can be so revealing, because They offer insights into how the individual interacts in different environments and social contexts, so you get a more complete and nuanced understanding of their strengths and challenges.
I can see how that's valuable,
Yeah.
especially since, autism can present so differently in different settings. Like you might be very articulate and engaging in a one-on-one conversation, but then really struggle in a crowded, noisy environment.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why this holistic approach is so essential, because it makes sure that the diagnosis isn't based on just a snapshot of behavior. It takes into account the individual's experiences across various aspects of their life. Now that we've gone over the process of getting a diagnosis, let's discuss what it means to receive one. It's not just a clinical label, it's a life-changing event.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a deeply personal experience, and the guide doesn't shy away from addressing the emotional weight of it all, which is something that I'm really glad about and that we're going to delve into in more detail later.
But before we move on, I think it's important to highlight that even if the evaluation doesn't result in an autism diagnosis, it can still be incredibly valuable
Yeah.
because it might uncover other conditions that explain the challenges that someone is facing.
That's a really good point. Could
Yeah.
be things like ADHD, anxiety, sensory processing disorder, which are often, overlooked or misdiagnosed. So having that clarity could be incredibly empowering, even if the outcome isn't what you initially expected.
Yeah, it really is amazing how that clarity can be so empowering, even
Yeah.
if it's not the diagnosis that you were expecting. But let's say it does confirm an autism diagnosis. What then? What are the next steps? This guide does a really great job of kind of outlining all the resources that are out there, which can feel a little overwhelming at first.
It can be a lot,
Yeah.
but I think the guide does a good job of breaking it down into, manageable pieces.
Hmm.
And one of the first things that it highlights are the different types of therapies that could be so beneficial for individuals on the spectrum.
Right. I see they list speech therapy, occupational therapy, and social skills training as a few of the key players. But I've always wondered, how do those actually help? How do those therapies actually help someone with autism kind of navigate the world better? That's a great question. Each therapy targets specific challenges and helps, individuals develop those essential life skills. So, for instance, speech therapy, it's not just about pronunciation. It can also help individuals with autism learn to interpret those social cues in communication. So, things like understanding tone of voice or facial
Oh,
expressions.
so it's not just about the words themselves. It's like that whole intricate dance of social interaction that happens through language.
Exactly. And then occupational therapy, it goes beyond just, fine motor skills. It can also address sensory processing issues, which are so common in autism. Imagine being constantly bombarded by sensory input, sounds, lights, textures that most people just filter out easily. Occupational therapy can help individuals develop strategies to manage those sensory experiences so they can better focus and engage in, their surroundings.
Right. And then the guide also mentions social skills training, which I imagine is pretty crucial for navigating a world that's, so built on social interaction.
It is. It's all about giving individuals the tools to understand and respond appropriately in social situations. So they might practice things like initiating conversations, reading body language, understanding those unspoken social rules, which can be really tricky for someone with autism.
It sounds like each of these therapies really plays a vital role in kind of building a foundation for independence and success. But the guide also doesn't shy away from the fact that these therapies can be expensive.
Yeah, you're right. And that's where, understanding the financial resources that are available can make a huge difference. The guide highlights options like Medicaid, private insurance coverage, even disability benefits.
It's so important to have that information readily accessible because it can be so daunting trying to navigate all of those systems on your own,
Right.
especially when you're already dealing with all of the emotional and logistical challenges of a new diagnosis.
Absolutely. And then the guide also lists some fantastic autism organizations like Autism Speaks, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, and they really emphasize the importance of connecting with local autism centers.
It sounds like those organizations can really be a lifeline for families and individuals who are seeking support and community. What I appreciate is that the guide goes beyond just listing those names. It also gives a brief overview of what each organization offers, which helps you figure out, where to go for specific needs.
Yeah, that's so important. You want to be able to quickly identify which organization aligns with your values and your priorities. So, for example, ASAN is known for its strong focus on self-advocacy and empowering autistic voices, whereas Autism Speaks emphasizes research and family support.
It's great that there are so many options out there,
Right.
but I always love to hear about those hidden gems, those resources that maybe aren't as well known.
Yeah.
Do you have any favorites that you find yourself sharing with families that you work with?
I do. There's a therapeutic approach that I'm particularly passionate about, and it's not something you'll find in every guide. It's called neurodiversity affirming
Yeah,
therapy.
I've heard that term. But I admit I'm not entirely sure what it means in practice. What makes it different from other therapies?
Well, it's a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of viewing autism as a disorder that needs to be fixed, it recognizes autism as a natural variation of the human brain, a different way of experiencing and interacting with the world.
So it's not about, trying to force someone with autism to conform to neurotypical norms.
Exactly. It's about celebrating those unique strengths and perspectives that come with being autistic. So, neurodiversity affirming therapists help individuals understand and embrace their autistic identity. They help them develop coping mechanisms for challenges that arise from living in a neurotypical world. And they help them advocate for their needs in a way that feels authentic to them.
I can see how that would be incredibly empowering. It's really about, you know, meeting people where they are and supporting them on their own terms.
Precisely. And it often involves helping individuals develop strategies for, sensory regulation, social communication, emotional well-being, but always with the understanding that these are tools to help them navigate the world, not attempts to change who they are at their core.
That's so refreshing to hear. It's really a reminder that a diagnosis doesn't have to be a label that limits someone. It can be a key to unlocking their full potential.
Absolutely. It's about reframing the narrative from one of deficits to one of strengths and possibilities.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from understanding the different therapies that are available to exploring the nuances of neurodiversity affirming therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure our listeners are already feeling much more informed and empowered,
Mm,
but we're not done yet. There's another layer to this whole experience that's equally important to address.
you're right. We've talked about the practicalities, the resources, but now it's time to really dive into the heart of it all, the emotional landscape of an autism diagnosis.
Because receiving a diagnosis, whether it's for yourself or for someone you love, it's more than just a clinical event. It's a deeply personal experience that can evoke a whole range of emotions.
Exactly. And exploring those emotions, understanding their nuances, is crucial for navigating this journey with grace and resilience. And we'll delve into all of that in our final part.
And we are back for the final part of our deep dive on autism diagnosis.
Hmm.
We've really covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the process, the resources, but now we're really getting into the heart of it, the emotional experience.
Yeah, because, receiving that diagnosis, whether it's for yourself or for a loved one, it's a huge life event.
It really is. It's a journey.
Yeah.
And this guide, I'm so glad that it acknowledges that. It can be an emotional roller coaster. There's no right way to feel.
Absolutely. And the guide does a great job of emphasizing that it's okay to feel a whole mix of emotions, relief, confusion, maybe even a sense of grief. Those are all valid responses.
One of the things that I found so reassuring about the guide is how it really emphasizes that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay to feel all those things. Yeah. Like you might feel a sense of relief. You finally have an answer for something that you've been struggling to understand for years.
Hmm.
But then there's also that confusion of like, okay, now what? What does this mean? And then even grief for some people, grieving the life that they thought they would have or the life that they thought their loved one would have.
Yeah, and all of those are valid.
Mm.
Some people do feel that immediate sense of relief, like you said. They finally have an explanation for experiences they've never quite understood. And for others, it can be a time of, real confusion trying to wrap their heads around what this new understanding means for their future. And yeah, like you said, for some, there might be a sense of grief, mourning the life that they envisioned either for themselves or for their child.
It's like you almost need a roadmap for those emotions because they can be so intense. Does the guide offer any advice on, how to actually process these feelings?
Yeah, one of the most important things is to just allow yourself to feel those emotions without judgment, create space for them, whether that's through journaling, talking to a therapist, connecting with a support group. Having that outlet to express and process those feelings is so important.
It's so easy to get caught up in all the logistics, right? Finding the right therapies, navigating all the resources that we talked about. It's like we go into problem-solving mode, which of course is important, but sometimes we forget to also take care of our own emotional well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And neglecting that emotional side of things can actually make it harder to cope in the long run. It can lead to burnout.
And that's something that the guide touches on too. The idea that a diagnosis, it's not an ending, it's a beginning. It's the start of a new chapter, a journey of understanding and acceptance.
I love that. It really is a journey. It's about shifting your perspective from, what do I do now, to what does this mean for me? How can I use this knowledge to live a more fulfilling life?
Yeah, and that journey of self-discovery can be so empowering. The guide highlights how a diagnosis can actually help individuals, really understand their strengths and embrace their unique way of being in the world.
It's interesting because for some individuals, a diagnosis can be incredibly liberating. It's like all the pieces of the puzzle suddenly click into place. They finally understand why they experience the world the way they do, why social interactions can be so challenging, why they thrive in certain environments and struggle in others.
It's like finding a sense of belonging that you didn't even know you were searching for.
Exactly. And with that understanding comes the ability to advocate for yourself, to create a life that really aligns with your strengths and your preferences.
Mhm.
It's about recognizing that being different is not a deficit. It's just a
Mhm.
different way of being brilliant.
Well, this whole conversation has been so insightful. We've really gone from feeling overwhelmed by all the complexities of autism diagnosis to feeling like, wow, there's actually so much possibility here.
Yeah. And if I could leave our listeners with one final thought, it would be this: embrace the journey. It will have its ups and downs, its moments of joy and frustration, but it's a journey of growth and self discovery.
And remember, you are not alone. There's a whole community of individuals, families, professionals who are there to support you every step of the way.
So keep asking questions, keep seeking knowledge, and keep celebrating the unique beauty of neurodiversity.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into autism diagnosis. We hope you've learned a lot and feel empowered to keep exploring this fascinating and ever-evolving world. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open.